At the entrance to Disneyland in California, there's a plaque that reads, "Here you leave today and enter the world of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy." This idea of stepping into a fantasy world is something that's taken very seriously at Disney. The Imagineers that originally designed Disneyland in the 1950s were not predominantly theme park designers. Instead, they mostly had backgrounds as filmmakers and animators. And so when it came to the Disneyland project, they approached it in much the same way as they would when making a Disney movie, putting painstaking detail into this idea of complete immersion, transporting guests out of Southern California and into whatever setting the show of Disneyland would require. And one way that this was achieved was through the extensive use of sightlines. At its core, the concept of a sightline is pretty simple. It's the line of sight. Video over. More specifically though, it's the consideration of visibility, where a newly constructed building can be seen from and what will be blocked by it. Lots of places in the world deal with sightlines. Cities like London, Austin, Texas, and Portland, Oregon all have protected sightlines, for example, to prevent the blocking of views of famous buildings, or in Portland's case, Mount Hood. But at Disney, sightlines can be used by Imagineers for more than just good views. As well as being able to reveal things, sightlines can also be used to block things from view, to hide behind the scenes areas from guests, and to funnel guests' attention to particular areas of the park, much like you would when framing a shot of a movie. When used correctly, the combination of these effects allows for a heightened sense of immersion beyond the average theme park, and is one of the things that I think gives Disney an edge over its competitors. So in this video, let's take a look at Disney's use of sightlines at their parks around the world, how they use them to create some of the best looking theme parks on the planet, and what it looks like when they get things wrong. So let's first take a look at some of the ways Disney parks maintain their illusion by blocking sightlines, because I feel this is the main way sightlines are used at Disney. When you first enter Disneyland and pass under the plaque mentioned earlier, you'll notice that the Main Street train station is elevated above you, and the two entranceways to the park are tunnels underneath the tracks. The reason for this isn't just to make the train station more prominent, however, it's actually to help you pass through the berm. Now what exactly is the berm? Well, apart from sounding like some exclusive nightclub where nobody talks about what goes on inside, in reality, the berm is a massive dirt mound perimeter around the entirety of the park that was made when Disneyland was first built, roughly following the Disneyland Railroad. This way, the sights and sounds of surrounding Anaheim would be blocked out of view from guests, so that a trip to Fantasyland could feel more like you really were in a fantasy world, and wouldn't be ruined by the sight of a car driving by on the highway. This of course got even more important as Anaheim grew over the decades to the urban sprawl that it is today. Because guests typically see the park from a ground level, most sightline considerations are only concerned with this perspective, making the berm a very simple but incredibly effective way of controlling sightlines within your theme park. You'll see the berm, or a similar enclosing perimeter, being used again and again across the Disney parks, particularly at the various castle parks around the world. In fact, it's probably the main way that sightlines are controlled at Disney. What's interesting about the berm at Disneyland though, is how it's changed and been modified over the years as the park has expanded. Because it had the additional side effect of boxing Disneyland in, or maybe berming Disneyland in, as new attractions and entire lands were added, the original boundaries of the park had to be breached without revealing sightlines to the outside world. In a lot of cases, this can be a simple tunnel underneath the railroad to a land with all the facades built around its edges as a sort of berm extension, such as is the case of Disneyland's Toontown. Ever wondered why Toontown has these massive hill cutouts? Well, aside from theming, it's also to block the giant utility buildings that sit directly behind the land. But two much more interesting examples of working around the berm are the two classic attractions, the Haunted Mansion and Pirates of the Caribbean. When these were built in the 60s, they were both too large to fit within the original confines of the park. So to combat this, Imagineers decided to put the bits that guests can see from the outside, the facades and queue areas, inside the berm. But the actual show buildings where the majority of the ride takes place on the other side of the railroad, as guests don't ever see the exteriors of these buildings. This way, a ride taking place in a haunted mansion can actually look like a haunted mansion from the outside, without needing to be this massive oversized shed. For the Haunted Mansion, the mansion building itself only contains the stretching room pre-show, actually identical stretching rooms, and a small part of the queue. At the point that the room starts stretching, the ceiling doesn't lift up, but instead the floor lowers down, as guests descend into a basement level. Guests then walk through a long corridor to the loading bay, going underneath the railroad and the berm to the main show building where the ride takes place. This is why at the exit of the attraction you have to walk up a ramp to leave. At Disney World though, the stretching room doesn't lower guests underground and the ceiling does raise, with guests walking inside the main show building tucked away backstage. Its sightlines hidden by trees and a raised bank where the pet cemetery is located. As for Pirates of the Caribbean, this ride takes guests on the other side of the berm when they're on the ride itself, using a drop to lower the boat to the right level. At Disneyland, there are 2 drops, with the main building containing the Blue Bayou and the Skeleton Sea, as the ride loops back on itself so it can get low down enough to make it under the railroad before entering the main show building for the fort scene. Whereas at Disney World, there isn't actually much of a berm in this part of the park, but the ride still takes you under the railroad tracks using a ramp in the loading area, and this time just 1 drop on the ride itself. And as a side note, Disney World's Space Mountain also has a similar ramp that takes you down and then back up during the queue to take you underneath the railroad. Similarly in Fantasyland, the original berm was removed in one spot to make room for It's a Small World, with the railroad passing behind it and the tall facades of It's a Small World becoming a part of the new barrier, hiding its large show building from view. Moving beyond the berm now, it's also important to not just block the outside world from view, but to block out other parts of the park if they don't fit the area's theme. Ideally, when you're in Fantasyland, you never want to be able to see the futuristic facades of Tomorrowland in the distance, and when you're in Frontierland, you don't want to see the jungles of Adventureland poking out in the background. And while it's not always possible to block absolutely everything from everywhere, Disney Imagineers have employed a lot of tricks over the years to cover areas they don't want you to see. Entrances to lands often begin with meandering, transitional areas without too much major theming that guide you around a corner so that once you enter the land proper, you're no longer in view of the place you just came from. Take Discoveryland at Disneyland Paris as an example. You leave the hub and enter the land through this curved U shape in the road, which means that once you're in the land for real, the combination of the Constellation souvenir shop, the rockwork at the land's entrance, and this group of trees on the other side of the hub at the entrance to Adventureland line up perfectly to close off the view behind you. Over in California, if you look closely in Disneyland's Frontierland, you may notice this triangular shaped tree poking out among the rest. This tree is used to hide a sightline to the Matterhorn on the other side of the park, as it would be unusual to see a snow-capped European mountain in the American desert. But if something is simply too large to be blocked out, you can always try and blend it in with the theming of the area. The large spires of Black Spire Outpost at Disneyland's Galaxy's Edge fit in the background of the rockwork surrounding the rivers of America on the Disneyland Railroad. I've also seen it suggested online that, inversely, the theming of Galaxy's Edge has the added benefit that Big Thunder Mountain now fits neatly into the background. The Matterhorn also lines up with the miniature mountains of the Storybook Land canal boats. At Tokyo Disney Sea in Japan, the park is built right on Tokyo Bay, but due to the park having a nautical theme, it didn't need to block out the views of the water with tall facades. Instead, Imagineers built smaller walls and rockwork themed to the respective areas that still allow you to see out to the water. Although, what's even more interesting about this is that the parts that are made to look like harbour walls don't actually touch the bay, but rather face out onto a main road outside the park, which sits below both the park and the real harbour wall, meaning that guest sightlines allow them to see out into the bay without being able to see the main road in front of it. And perhaps the most well-known example of blending things into the background at a Disney park is at Epcot's Morocco Pavilion, where, when viewed from across the lagoon, Hollywood Studios' Tower of Terror can be seen in the distance. Imagineers were of course aware of this sightline when building the Tower of Terror in 1994, and so while from the front its architecture is inspired by 1930s Hollywood, from the back the tower is designed more in a Spanish colonial revival style, so it would blend in with the Moroccan skyline. As well as blocking unwanted things from view, Imagineers also carefully plan the layout of the park to reveal sightlines at just the right moment, to funnel guests into specific areas and towards specific attractions. And the most common way this is done is by using one of the best named things in the Disney parks: weenies.
What weenies?
Weenies are Disney's name for all the big, iconic structures that grab guests' attention and act as a hook to draw them closer in. The most obvious of these are the castles at Disney's 6 castle parks, which all sit at the end of their respective main streets with a sightline all the way down, to pull guests in and encourage them further into the park. But most areas at all the Disney parks have their own weenies too. To use Disneyland as an example, while Sleeping Beauty's castle serves as the park's initial weenie, once you've approached it, a sightline to the Matterhorn is also revealed, and to your right you'll also see Astro Orbiter, which serves as Tomorrowland's weenie. If you decide to enter Frontierland, the first sightline will reveal to the Mark Twain riverboat, from which you can either look left to see Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion, or right to see Big Thunder Mountain. Fantasyland's weenie is the King Arthur Carousel, which can be seen all the way through the middle of the castle. This sightline of the carousel lining up with the walkway through the castle was considered so important to hook guests into Fantasyland that when Walt Disney World's carousel was built in the early 70s and it was discovered that it didn't line up exactly, the entire thing was torn up and moved just 8 inches to make it fit perfectly. And as for Adventureland, this is the only one of Disneyland's main lands that doesn't have a weenie, as it's deliberately designed to be a mysterious place that guests have to uncover. Across all the Disney parks, weenies are used to pull you into an area, and when you're there, you'll often be presented with another weenie to move you to another area. This thing that I've sort of called the weenie to weenie waypoint system allows guests to feel like they're always discovering something new and interesting to look at. At Hollywood Studios, as you enter the park and look down Hollywood Boulevard, you see the Chinese Theatre pulling you in. Or at one point you saw the hat, but we don't really talk about the hat anymore. Then as you walk down Hollywood Boulevard before reaching the theatre, you eventually find the crossroad into Sunset Boulevard. If you choose to take this path instead and round the slight corner, a sightline is then revealed to the park's other major weenie, the imposing Hollywood Tower Hotel, or the Tower of Terror, looming on the hill in the distance. This slight bend in the road might seem incidental, but it's used to great effect to obscure the Tower of Terror before the sightline is correctly set up, so that when you finally see it, you get the best possible view. This is also done with the entrances to the castle parks, with how you enter through a tunnel on either the far left or the far right, but the buildings of Main Street hug close to the street to block your view of what's ahead, pulling you across into the centre of the road where you get your first view of the castle. Another attraction that makes good use of a carefully framed and positioned sightline is Expedition Everest at Animal Kingdom. Expedition Everest is pretty tall, so there's no real way to completely hide it from view, particularly from outside of the park, but it still has some pretty good reveals, like how it sits slightly deeper in the park, leading to it being blocked by the Finding Nemo the Musical building until you round the corner and it suddenly comes into view, poking above the trees. The trees being intentionally placed here so they obscure the base of the mountain, making it look much larger and further away than it actually is. But the best view of Expedition Everest is down by the water near Kali River Rapids, where the trees along the bank break to give you this iconic, imposing view of the mountain, with Tibetan monuments in the foreground alluding to its importance. And of course, in classic Disney style, when you stand in the right spot, the peaks of this particular monument line up perfectly with the peaks of Everest. You won't get that sort of detail at Universal, I'll tell you that. Honestly, Everest is just great. I could talk about it all day. Once you know about the concept of weenies, you start noticing everywhere how Disney funnels you from weenie waypoint to weenie waypoint, how the entrances to lands curve around bends to set up weenie sightlines, and how weenies line up for perfect photo opportunities. So far, weenies, the berm, the blending of background objects, and the hiding of show buildings have all been pretty successful ways to create good sightlines and maintain the illusion of the Disney parks. But over the years, and in particular more recently, Disney's commitment to sightlines has come under criticism from fans, as new attractions and structures have broken the illusion in places, or simply been built with no consideration for sightlines whatsoever. When the Swan and Dolphin hotels were built during the Eisner era, they were simply placed close to Epcot, with little consideration for how they might interfere with the park's sightlines. And so the Swan Hotel was viewable behind the France Pavilion, which disrupted the sightline and also messed with the forced perspective of the Eiffel Tower. Several decades later, the Eiffel Tower illusion was upset once more by the opening of the Skyliner, which allowed guests to see the tower from an angle not originally planned for. The introduction of studio-themed parks, first with MGM, now Hollywood Studios, and then later with Walt Disney Studios in Paris, also represented Disney wavering from their strict sightlines. As with these parks, the ability to see show buildings could be cheaply dealt with by decorating them as sound stages, and the general movie studio theme allowed for corners to be cut when it came to immersion. In recent years, the replacement to Ellen's energy adventure, Guardians of the Galaxy Cosmic Rewind, has been criticised for its absolutely gigantic show building sitting in plain view of Future World, lazily painted sky blue to try and blend it into the background more. When the Disneyland version of Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway was being built in Toontown, the hill facade mentioned earlier was taken down, revealing the huge show building behind it, dwarfing the land. But I do think it's kind of funny what Disney's solution for this was, because they put a banner on the building saying, "What big building? There's no big building here." I should also say that this was only temporary, as now a new, larger hill facade has been built to hide the new building. As well as these large boxes that Disney's been building recently, they've also slipped on maintaining the theming in certain areas with the introduction of some of the new Marvel attractions at California Adventure. In particular, the way that the re-theming of DCA's Tower of Terror to Guardians of the Galaxy Mission Breakout has created these odd sightlines on the Buena Vista Street and Hollywoodland areas that don't fit with the theming of the area anymore. Although Disney did try, albeit kind of half-heartedly in my opinion, to explain this away by saying that the Mission Breakout building was temporarily transported to the area, and that's why it looks out of place. So it may seem like I'm suggesting that the era of good sightlines at Disney is over, and the commitment to immersive theming is getting progressively worse as time goes on. The old thing good, new thing bad. But that's not entirely true. While there have been a lot of poor sightlines recently, that's not the full story. And some of the more recent additions to the Disney parks have also been some of the most immersive areas created. In 2012, Cars Land was opened at California Adventure, a recreation of Radiator Springs and the surrounding area from the movie Cars. The area is fantastically well designed and makes great use of rockwork to block out the nearby hotels just outside. And of course, 2019's Galaxy's Edge at both Hollywood Studios and Disneyland is perhaps the most immersive area of a theme park Disney has ever built, fully enclosing itself in large spires, with long tunnel entrances to block out both the outside world and the other areas of the park, and a full-size Millennium Falcon to act as the land's weenie. I think as the Disney parks continue to expand and ambitions for attractions grow in scale, it can be difficult to ensure that there aren't any bad sightlines that ruin immersion, particularly when a new attraction has to go in the space of an older one, and so you don't have the luxury of working from the ground up. It was definitely a lot easier to deal with in the early days of Disneyland, when the park wasn't anywhere near as dense as it is today. But I think places like Galaxy's Edge and Cars Land prove that sightlines aren't a dying art, and it can still be done. It's not like all of the original sightlines are gone either. Most are still around. And to be honest, while good sightlines are always appreciated, they're not the be-all and end-all of a good theme park. Although that being said, sightlines and this attention to detail that can make you feel like you've been transported into another world rather than a parking lot in a Florida swamp do still go a long way. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed my look at how sightlines are used in the Disney parks. This is such a broad topic, as the parks are just completely littered with different things I could say about sightlines. So if there are some cool examples of Disney sightlines that you can think of that I haven't mentioned, please let me know about them in the comments. This channel has also had a pretty big boost in the past couple of weeks, so there's a lot more of you here than when I released my last video. A few days back I hit 10,000 subscribers, which is amazing, and I wasn't really sure that that was going to happen this year. These videos take a while to make, but there will definitely be more Disney and other theme park content for you all to watch soon. And if you haven't seen my other videos on the Disney parks, please go and check them out. Lastly, if you're not already, please consider subscribing. If there's anything else you'd like me to cover on the channel, please let me know. And as always, I'll see you next time.